Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar, talking Cat5, Cat5S connections, RJ45 connectors, and Ethercon Housing with Fedj Sylvanus. My name is Mallory Misnarsic and I'm the project manager here at Harman. Just a few things before we get started. Everyone on the call is muted to keep down noise levels during this webinar. However, there is a Q&A function where you can submit questions to the presenter and he'll try to answer as many as possible at the end. This webinar will also be recorded and a link will be made available for you a few days after this presentation. We do have a number of other webinars taking place over the next few months for audio, lighting, video, and control. We encourage you to take a look at the different webinars in our Learning Sessions workshop series on pro.harman.com, as well as visiting Harman Professional Training to see our many on-demand and certification courses that are available to you for free. And now I'd like to introduce you to Fedj, the presenter for today's webinar. Currently the Chief Repair and Fabrication Technician at RatSound, Fedj has over 40 years of experience as a front of house and monitor engineer, tour and production manager, technician and electrician for artists including Akon, Aretha Franklin, Patti LaBelle, Toto, Primus, Fishbone, and Red Hot Chili Peppers. And now I'll pass it over to you, Fedj.
Thank you, Mallory. Hi, everybody. My name is Fedj. That's Jeff backwards. It's an old nickname and it's stuck. If you've joined me before, I'm sure you've heard the routine. We're doing things a little differently than I have in the past, as the situation here in Los Angeles is getting a little sticky. I've pre-recorded the session for the demonstration, and I'm going to start that now and then join you back at the end for the Q&A. So I hope you all enjoy it. Thanks.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Fedj's little house of Ethernet cables. Yes, we're going to be talking about Ethernet cables, Cat5, and we're going to be talking about Cat5E, which is Cat5 enhanced. Runs a little faster, can handle a little more data. Cat6. I don't have a scrap, but we'll cover everything we need to know when we get to Cat7. And we'll be talking about Cat7. This is a standard. And there's also the Sound Tools Cat7 cable, which is a bit more robust, and we'll get to that as we go into the connectors. I wish I had time to tell you about the Super Cat. Now, this is a really robust cable. It's Cat7 rated. It can actually be used for 4 individual mic lines if you wanted to. But for today, we're going to stick with everything that's needed for the RJ45. Now, any of these cables have a rating written on the side of each cable that will tell you what each cable is. As far as Cat5, Cat5E, Cat6, Cat7, and so on. We're going to be talking about the dreaded RJ45 connector. Now, there are a lot of different types out there. The most widely used is the Cat5 with no shielding, just a straight plastic connector, and all you need is the cheapest of crimp tools to make it work. This unit's probably about $20 to $40, and it does just fine for the standard RJ45 and the RJ45 shielded. Now, the standard is just plastic with the gold-plated terminals, 8 of them. But there is also a shielded model that comes encased in metal, and the shield wire for those shielded cables connects to it and gives you a robust connection to the shield from one end of the cable to the other. And that is inherently necessary for protection of your data. But when it comes to Cat7 and Cat6 for that matter, we use the nice stuff. This is certainly a more expensive connector. The harder plastic shown in yellow is an indicator of it. and it comes with this nifty little insert. It actually keeps the wires intact in their position in their correct color code while you're assembling the connector. It also has a lovely little wraparound for the shield connection, but such a nice connector requires a rather expensive crimper. This is a $400 tool. I wish I had the model number of the tool and the RJ45 connector that we use, but unfortunately I don't have that information with me. But just so you know, when we're dealing with higher data speeds and quantity, we want to make sure that those connectors are up to spec. So first thing we're going to talk about is Cat5. Cat5 is the bottom of the barrel, so to speak, with Ethernet cable. It's just a single jacket around 4 pair of wires. Each pair is twisted at a different rate, and that way to cut down on the interference of electromagnetism. And I'm going to open them up just so you can see what's inside of each. Now notice I have taken a razor knife to open up the jacket. I'm not sawing through the jacket, I'm just rolling the knife blade across. All I want to do is break open the jacket. I do not want to penetrate the jackets of the individual conductors beneath, so I'm being very careful. Once I got the jacket open, I can separate the pairs of wires. They come in the same color codes, green, orange, blue, and brown. Green is indicated with a solid green, a striped green, orange, solid orange, and a striped orange. Blue, same deal, solid blue and a striped blue, and the same for brown, striped brown and solid brown. You'll find a little nylon cord in most of them to give the cable a little extra strength, but that's all there is to it, just 4 pair of wires. Now, as far as the Cat5E, the E stands for enhanced, and it can carry a little more data a little faster, or actually more data per second is a better way to calibrate that. I am stripping away the jacket of this, the same routine. I just want to break the jacket open. I want to make sure I'm not cutting into anything beneath the jacket. So you'll notice I'm going all the way around, very carefully, just rolling the blade across. I would imagine that there are specific strippers for this, but I prefer doing it with the razor blade because I have a better feel for it. Anyway, once the jacket is partially cinched, I can open the rest of it up. Now, this particular cable just has a mylar jacket for the shield. I'm going to remove that and set it off to the side. It also has, along with the regular Cat5, it has a little nylon cord running to it to add some strength. But it also has this ground wire. That wire connects directly to the shield, the mylar shield that runs all the way through the cable and protects the individual pairs. But that's about all it's got for shielding. The individual pairs are just wrapped around a clear plastic mylar wrap. So we'll remove that and get that out of the way, and you'll be able to see the same basic deal as the Cat5. 4 pairs of wires, same color codes, a pair of green, a pair of orange, a pair of blue, and a pair of brown. Now, you gotta keep an eye out for the gauge of the wire. Some manufacturers have a larger gauge. Generally speaking, we're talking about 23, 24 gauge wire. But when we're talking about Cat7, more so than anything else, we're going to put the nice connector on it using the nice expensive tool, but we use the less expensive tool for the less expensive RJ45s. It would be nice if the cheaper tool worked for the nicer RJ45N, but unfortunately it's specific to that particular model. So the Cat7, both issues of them that I have displayed, we're going to connect with those RJ45s. The yellow plastic indicates it's a bit harder of a plastic. It has that lovely little insert that keeps the wires in their proper order. And if you'll notice, I'm gauging with the connector how much material I'm going to strip off, how much of the jacket I'm going to strip off. Now, I only need basically the amount of the length of the connector, but I'm about to double that. The reason being I need the extra slack so I can straighten out the conductors inside, as you will see when we get to the connections itself. Once I've marked where I want to strip it, I will bend it over, and the same routine. I want to be very careful just to go through the jacket. One of the major differences between the Cat7, and you'll find this in the Cat6 as well, not just a Mylar jacket, or I'm sorry, not just a Mylar shield, but inside of this cable you'll find that there is a lovely braided wire shield. So I'm trying to be very careful not to cut through any of those wires. Now, the easiest way to open up the shield is to push down like you would a Chinese finger puzzle, or whatever you call those things. At any rate, start at the loose end of the braid, and I'm just using a standard awl to separate the wires. Separate them all the way down until you get to the bottom of the braid, and then gap the wires around the individual pairs. You'll notice in the Cat7 that the individual pairs are also wrapped in their own individual Mylar shield. This is better protection for the data running down each pair. And depending on the equipment you're using, just because you're using a piece of cable that can handle more data per second does not mean that your data speed is going to increase. It just means that the cable is capable of handling that much more data per second. At any rate, I've separated the 4 pairs. Inside of the Cat6, you'll find the same 4 pairs. The only difference being in most Cat6 that I've seen, it's a single shield, a nice braided wire being used as a shield right under the jacket. But the individual pairs are not necessarily shielded as they are in the Cat7. So with the Cat7 open, I have removed all the Mylar shields around each individual pair, and there you see the same 4 colors: a pair of green, a pair of orange, a pair of blue, and a pair of brown. Now, as I mentioned, this is the Sound Tools Cat7, and written on the side of each of these cables, if you read the fine print, you will find the specifications of the cable. Same deal applies with this. I'm going to use the connector to gauge how much I'm going to strip off of the outer jacket. And once again, I'm going to be very careful just to cut through the jacket alone and not any of the innards of the cable. And also with this, as soon as the jacket gets off of there, You will see it also comes with a nice braided shield. Each individual pair is also covered with a mylar shield. I've removed those just so you can see that we have the same 4-pair wire. We still have a ground wire, and we still have the same 4 color codes to work with. So with that, that's a basic description of the innards of each of the cables. Gathering them all together, I'm going to set up to start applying what would be our standard in the industry, an Ethercon housing for the RJ45. This protects the connector through all kinds of mayhem, and it also provides a much more secure connection at the equipment that we're using. Now, be sure that any of the cable you're getting for this is stranded cable, not solid. The reason being it needs to be flexible to apply to most of the work that we do. Now, this particular Ethercon housing is the NE8MXB1. It is the new issue of it. I believe it was about 3 years ago that they came out with it. The model number is the same as the old style. However, the old style came with a lot of different bushings to keep the RJ45 connector in its correct position. The new one, all you need is the cable grip. No more bushings, it's just one piece. Now, before we start on anything, we need to make sure that the boot for the Ethercon is on the cable. Now, that would be great if that's all we were doing, but most often you're going to need to label. And the only time you're going to get a chance to put some shrink tubing onto this cable is before you've connected anything to it. So right now is a good time to think about clear shrink, so you can put a label underneath it. Whatever company you're working with or whoever owns the equipment might have a bit of shrink tubing with their logo on it. It might just be a sticker, but that clear shrink tubing is a great way to protect whatever label you've got, including lengths of the cable and all of that. Now, keep in mind, because we've stripped off so much of the jacket, you need to keep that in mind when you're cutting the length of the cable. Let's say you've got a 100-foot cable. Well, you'll notice I'm stripping off more than I need to make the connection. So you got to keep that in mind. If you're cutting 100 feet, you might want to add an extra couple of inches just to make sure that you've got enough to do the stripping in a proper manner. You'll see in a moment why we need that extra wire, because the 4 twisted pairs of wire have been that way since they were manufactured. They have kinks and bends and whatnot that are inherent to the nature of the wire as they sit. So I want to get those as clean and flat and wonderful as I can. Now, you'll notice I've just stripped everything off at the end. Just wanted to tell you now, before you even start stripping everything off, you might want to think about your shrink tubing, your company label, shrink tubing, and most importantly, the boot. But a lot of times I find it more advantageous, depending on the thickness of the cable, to strip the end first. It's easier to fit through the hole of the boot, and sometimes it can be advantageous to do that. So let's get to the Cat5. Cat5 has the same 4 pair of wires as everybody else. It just does not have a shield. It does not have a ground. So I'm going to separate the 4 pairs. We're going to use the B standard. There are 2 standards in Ethernet color codes for the connection. There's an A standard and a B standard. The only difference being that in the A standard, the green pair goes first. In the B standard, the orange pair goes first. Military uses the B as a standard. Much of the international market as well uses the B standard. A standard is common in American manufacturing. But like I said, for our needs, I'm going to go ahead and use the B because Lord knows my equipment may be going overseas. So once I've got the individual wires separated, I'm going to put them in the proper order. In the B standard, we start with the orange and white, and then orange, solid orange, then green and white, then solid blue, blue and white, solid green, brown and white, and then solid brown. Now you'll notice I'm flattening out the wires, the individual conductors, as much as I can, making sure they're still in the proper order. And then you'll notice I will massage them, so to speak, between a pinch of my thumb and my forefinger to try and flatten them out and get as many of the kinks. When it comes to the RJ45 connector that I'm going to be using for just the Cat5, I'm just using the clear plastic RJ45 connector. The one I'm using is the easy version, as it is called. And the nice thing about it is it has a pass-through feature for all the conductors to go actually through the connector. Other connectors that are out there on the market, you have to trim the wire exactly to the specifications of the end of the RJ45 to make the crimp. The nice thing about the easy connectors is that I can put I can pass the wires all the way through and double check my wiring before I do the crimp. Now, you can use a multitude of tools to make the cut of the conductors themselves. I prefer the scissors. It makes a cleaner cut. It's easier to keep square, so I have a nice flat flush line of wires to go into the connector. And it's easier to see the copper ends of the wire inside of the connector when I need to check and make sure that my wires are in the proper place. Now, with the easy connectors, that's not so much of an issue, but it does become an issue with the other connectors that do not pass the wires through, and I'll show you that when we get to the yellow connector for the Cat7. So at any rate, I prep the wire as best I can. We've stretched it out and we've flattened it out as best we can. I'm going to measure how much of the wire I'm actually going to need for that connector. And keeping in mind, I want to keep a piece of the jacket going inside the butt end of the RJ45, so when I make the crimp, it actually crimps down on the jacket. So like I said, the nice thing about these particular connectors is they have a pass-through, and when I put the connector together on it, I need to make sure that I've got a nice flush cut to begin with, so all the wires go in at the same time. And at the same placement. So I'm keep in mind with all RJ45 connectors, we're starting on the flat side. We're looking at the flat side, not the catch side, to calibrate what our color code is going to be. Now, as you can see, I've slipped on the connector. and the extra length of wire is actually sticking out the other end of the connector. That makes it easy for me to double check and make sure before I make that crimp that I've got the color code correct. Because once I've made that crimp, that's it. You've only got one shot at the deal. Now you'll notice in the crimper there is a indication, a little extra notch for the catch side. So you need to make sure that you line that up properly. And once you've got the connector in there, you need to make sure it's going all the way in. The crimps are all the way at the butt end of the, or I should say the front end of the connector. So if it's not seated properly in the crimper, you won't make a good crimp, and it won't make contact, and you'll have to start all over from scratch. Once you've made that crimp, you can trim off the extra wire off the end. And at that point, you have a wonderful RJ45 connected to a Cat5 cable. Clear away your debris. And if you have a particular there's a little rubber boot that they make that protects the catch. And if you have one, that's great, that's wonderful, you should use it. But more commonly for any of our audio needs, we'll put an Ethercon end on these. However, for most of our just ordinary Cat5 connections, you're going to find that just the bare cable, just the RJ45 connector is going to be sufficient for our needs. It's usually inside of a rack. At any rate, with the tester, I'm testing all 8 leads to make sure they match up 1 to 1, 2 to 2, and so on. This tester also does test the ground, but since we're only dealing with a Cat5, there is no ground. So we've only got 8 conductors to test on a Cat5. So moving on, once we've got the Cat5 tested and we've made sure that everything works, if anything doesn't, we have no choice but to cut off the end and start all over again. So it's imperative that you double check, triple check, quadruple check all of the color codes and all of your connections before you make that crimp. Now let's move on to the Cat5E. The Cat5E is the first one we're going to deal with a shield. Now, before you strip the end, of course, you might want to think about putting your boot on. Before you put the boot on, you might want to think about putting on your shrink tubing and your label. But since we've already stripped off one end, we're going to start with that. Like I said, sometimes it's more advantageous to start with the stripped end because it'll fit through the hole in the boot easier. So we'll put our shrink tubing on, we'll put our label on, and then of course we will put our boot on. Now, Cat5E carries a little more data per second than standard Cat5, and with the shield, it's better to have that Ethercon housing. Makes a much better connection as far as chassis to chassis. The ground is much more protective, the better the conductivity between its connection and the chassis and whatever equipment you have. But also because we're carrying more data, you're apt to find it in a more sensitive location. and at hazard of suffering the pitfalls of manipulation. So the Ethercon housing keeps things intact. Once again, I'm gathering all of the conductors, putting them in their proper order, and then massaging all the kinks I can get out. Because they've been twisted for so long inside of that jacket, sometimes it takes a good few times to get them straight. Now, I'm ready for my connector, but I want to make sure I have a shielded connector. That means that there is a wrap of metal around the RJ45 connector. And it is set up for the crimp to actually make contact with the ground wire or the braid. Now, because of the shielded connectors that we've chosen, these are also easy connectors, so they have a pass-through. But for demonstration's sake, we're going to say that this is not a pass-through connector. So what I'm going to do with this is measure very carefully. I want to make sure that I have just a little bit of jacket inside the foot of the butt end of the connector, where the cable goes into the connector. And the reason for that is I want the crimp to come down on the jacket, not the conductors. The crimp at the terminals, at the connections, I want to be at only those conductors. But as far as down at the butt end of the connector, that crimp made down there makes a lot of difference in the longevity of the cable. I'm going to check and double check that my wires are all flat and straight and that my cut is nice and clean and square. And then I'm going to double check and make sure that the color code is correct. Remember, we are going from the flat side of the RJ45 connector when we're inserting the wire. Once I've got it at the correct length and everything's flat, I should be able to get the wires into the connector. Sometimes it's a bit of a challenge, so you've got to work it. Once I'm ready to seat it, you may notice that the opening, the aperture in the butt end of the RJ45 is not sufficient to handle the size of the jacket. So it may come down to grabbing a pair of pliers and putting a little squish around the jacket where the shield is coming out. Once again, I'm just trying to make sure everything's straight and flat and wonderful. Gauging once again the ends of my conductors to make sure they make it all the way to the end where the terminals are in the RJ45, and they're a little long. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to take the scissors and chop off just the right amount so that when I seat those wires in there, they reach just to the terminals. Okay, so now I'm going to try and seat this, and it goes, but I'm getting hung up at the jacket. I'm going to grab a pair of pliers, just standard needle nose, and I got to squash the end a little bit so it fits in the aperture at the butt end of the RJ45 a little better. Once I've done that, though, you'll find that the conductors themselves may have shifted a little bit. So once again, I'll double check my color codes and make sure I'm correct. keeping in mind again that we're starting with the orange because we're doing the B standard. And I want to make sure that those are in the correct order before I try and slip on that connector. Now, one is sitting a little low. You could take a pair of pliers and stretch it, but that's no good because the wire will stretch back. So if one is out of order with the rest of them, it's best to just trim again so that they're all exactly the same length. It makes a huge difference when you're making a connection. And like I said before, if you mess up the connection after you've made the crimp, you have no choice but to cut off the end and start all over. Make 4 or 5 mistakes, and now your cable's 4 or 5 inches shorter than it started out. And that could make a big difference. So double check, triple check, quadruple check, and make sure that your color codes are correct and that your wire lengths are correct and that everything is flat and square. Now that I've done that, I should be able to slip this connector right on over the wire, get them seated properly, and have a little bit of the jacket inside of the connector. Once again, I'm trimming just to make sure it's all flat. And sometimes it takes a few tries. But it's better to take the time to make those adjustments now rather than find out after you've made the crimp that you've made a bad connection. So now I've stuck the butt end. I've stuck the jacket into the butt end, so I've got some of the jacket inside of the connector. So when I make the crimp, it will crimp down on the jacket. And I've also checked to make sure that the each of the individual conductors is making it all the way to the end of the terminal connection. And now it's time for the crimper. I'm going to line it up so that the tab with the latch is lined up with the notch inside of the crimper. And I'm going to make my crimp. Also making sure that it goes all the way into the crimper before I press it. And now that I have, I can squish away. Now that the crimp is made, you'll find that the ground wire is now making contact with the shield of the connector. Now, some people like to wrap it over the top and put a spot of solder. It's not absolutely necessary. It's a little better protection for the longevity of the cable, but you can just trim off the excess with the assurance that that the shield is making contact with the shield of the connector. Now, like I said, with the new NE8 MXB1, and the B just stands for black, by the way. The NE8 MX-1 is just nickel colored, but it's the same exact unit. The new version, all you need is that cable grip to line everything up properly. You don't need extra bushings like the old style has. Now that I've made that connection, I want to make sure that everything is lined up correctly. Now, you are instructed to take the catch off of the little plastic catch off of your RJ45s. However, it is sometimes more efficient to leave that on there because sometimes at a show, let's say you have a failed connection, or a connection that you need to make without the Ethercon. If you don't have that latch, that little plastic latch on the RJ45 still there, you won't have a way of plugging it in and keeping it intact in the socket that you're going into. There is room for you to be able to leave that latch on and still make the Ethercon connection with the cable grip work just fine. So more often than not, I will leave it on. Now, one thing to look for on the Ethercon end, see that little hole on the end of the barrel? That lines up with the flat side of the RJ45. The smooth side of the barrel, the outside of the barrel of the Ethercon, lines up with the latch side. So it's pretty easy before you even start to see which way it's going to line up. It's oftentimes it's necessary to look down the barrel and make sure which way the RJ45 is going in. Now, notice when I tighten this right now. I put the barrel on, I've got the boot on, and I've tightened the barrel. But now I can't get it in the Ethercon connection. So it's always better before you tighten down on the boot to the rest of the barrel connection of the Ethercon. It's always a good move to leave it just barely finger tight. I've backed it off a little bit, but even that wasn't enough. So now I'm going to unscrew the whole thing, take the barrel back off, and verify that my cable grip is in the correct position. Line the barrel back up, stick the barrel back on, make sure it's protruding all the way to the front of the barrel, and I'm just going to lightly screw on the boot. Then I'm going to seat it in the Ethercon receptacle. And once it's seated, now I'm going to tighten it all the way up. That will assure you that the RJ45 inside of the Ethercon is in its correct position. And now I'm going to grab the tester. And my battery's running a little low in this tester, so you can barely see it, but it is going 1 through 8 and the ground. And it lines up 1 to 1 all the way across. And as long as I've made a good connection and double, triple, quadruple checked all of my color codes and all of the length of my wire and made sure everything is flat and wonderful, I've made a good connection. I can move on. Now to the Cat7. This is the purple, the Sound Tools Cat7. Like I said, this is a little more robust than the standard. It's a little thicker jacket. It's a better braided shield. But because it's Cat7, I want to make sure I'm using a nice connector. This carries a good deal more data per second than a standard Cat5. And a pretty significant amount more than the Cat5E. There's a chart at the end of this that will show you the different speeds, or I should say the amount of data per second capable in each of the different categories. By the way, if you don't know it, that's what CAT stands for, category. So category 5, category 5E, category 6, category 7, and so on. Now with the Cat7, I'm going to do the same basic protocol, separating all of my individual pairs and lining them up in the proper order so that I'm ready to insert it into the connector. But with the difference with this connector is that little plastic insert. Before I even get to trimming the wires down to make sure they're flat and smooth, the little insert has little grooves in it, so I can line up and thread the wire through it in the proper order. The real advantage of that is being able to keep my if you might have noticed how many times I had to adjust and make sure that my wires were in the correct order with the other connectors. With this little insert, it always keeps them in the same order. No matter what else happens, they are in the proper order as soon as I thread them. And it's very easy to see once you've threaded all the wires through the little insert to double check your color code and make sure it's accurate. Now, once I have those threaded, I want to gauge my measurement for the cut of the ends of those conductors. With the shield wire off to the side, I want to twist that up as tight as I can get it. So I'm just exposing all of the individual conductors. Now, the insert that I've threaded the wires to is going to go right up to the terminal side, the front side of the RJ45. Once I insert it into the connector. But I want to gauge to make sure that that crimp, the ground crimp at the butt end, is going to grab onto the jacket and the ground wire. So I need to make an accurate measurement as to where I need to make the cut with the scissors. And I've only got that one time to cut them. If there's a little indiscretion, I can get away with it like less than a millimeter. But I want to make sure all of those wires are the same length and flat. I'm going to double check my color codes, and I'm going to make sure those are all exactly the same length. Once I'm ready to insert it into the rest of the connector, you'll notice that with these particular connectors, that extra grip of the crimp for the ground can sometimes get in the way. So I'll take a pair of pliers and I'll open that up a little bit. It gives me a little more wiggle room to get the wires with the insert positioned correctly into the connector. Once I've got the wires in the correct position, I'll double check the front, I'll double check the side, and I'll double check the back end on the latch side, even just to make sure that everything's reaching all the way where it should be in the terminal block. Then I'm ready to make the crimp. I want to make sure that the ground wire is wrapped neatly so that it is down inside of the crimp. Now, some people will wrap completely around the inside of the ground connection to that crimp. And it's your discretion if you want to go that far. Some people I know have actually put a little spot of solder. Sometimes that can interfere, though, with installing the rest of the Ethercon. So I'd rather depend on the crimp itself. But with this tool, not only does it make the crimp connection to the terminals themselves, it also wraps that shield connection all the way around the cable, and makes for a much more durable, much more long-lasting connection. Once I've got the crimp complete, I am ready for, oh wait, what have I done? What did I forget to do? Well, I've got the ground wire all clipped off and nice and neat and everything's perfect. Oops. I forgot to put the boot on. So what can I do now? Well, I could take the whole thing off and start all over again. Or Nitrix was nice enough to make another model called the NE8MX. I'm using the NE8MXB, the B standing for black. But it's a nice thing to have around in the shop, along with your standard NE8MX-1. The NE8MX regular is set up so that you can connect an Ethercon to a cable that's already got an RJ45 on it. So there's a lovely little black ring that serves as the boot. You want to put that on first, and it goes right over the RJ45 connector. With this gauge of wire, I'm using the second option for the strain relief, which is just a plastic bushing. You'll notice two notches, or a notch, in the completed assembly of the bushing. The notch goes towards the RJ45. And then I can put the same cable grip, the same exact one that's in the other NE8MX1. I can put that on the cable and line it up so that my latch is on the correct side. And then I'm ready for the barrel. I will line that up so that the latch is going through on the smooth side of the barrel, and that the flat side of the RJ45 is on the side of the barrel with the hole in it. I won't tighten it all the way up until I have inserted it into an Ethercon receptacle, and now I'll tighten it down totally. And once I've done that, see, I've got myself an Ethercon connection, even though I already had the RJ45 on it. It's a different looking boot than the standard, but it does the same job and will save you a lot of time and trouble. Now, one last connector that I want to hip you to. This is called the NE8MX6. This is specifically for the higher end, everything from Cat6 and up. It's a much more robust connector. You don't have to worry about isolating or separating the pairs with this connector. All you have to do is follow the color codes that are on it. And there's a circuit board that does the separating of the one pair all for you. So it has indications for the number of the terminals that the colors are aligning with. And it also has on both sides, one side for the orange and one side for the green, it has both colors listed. It depends on if you want to do the A standard or the B standard as to where you're going to put the orange and where you're going to put the green. It's clearly labeled as to where each of those wires will terminate. There is a double-sided aluminum bushing that is used for the ground connection that you will wrap around just at the end of the assembly. You need to make sure before you strip the wire that you're allowing enough wire to go through the terminal connection on the circuit board portion of this connection. But also that you're allowing for that bushing. So when you line it up, not only are you first going to put your shrink tubing and your label and your boot onto your cable, you're going to line up everything so that you have the correct length. If you notice, I have the little aluminum bushing off to the side so I can see the length of cable I need to strip off, or the length of jacket I need to strip off. Now, going around, you can see the color codes. It's a little long shot, so it might be hard to see with this. But look it up online, NE8MX6. I'm using the NE8MX6-B for black, but that is the color code for that particular unit. It's a very robust connector. I believe it can handle even Cat8 as far as data speed per second, or data quantity per second, I should say. But it's very easy to line up all of the proper connections. And like I said, you can leave the pairs together. You don't need to separate the pairs with this connector. Sometimes as it works out, as I found with this, when I got to my brown leads, the final pair to be set into the connector, it was a little hard to reach, so I had to do some creative knitting, as it were, to go behind the other two connectors to get them into the right position to go into the proper terminals. But once everything is threaded, you'll notice that there's a black plastic housing around the circuit board that kind of holds the terminal sockets above the circuit board a little bit. The reason that's there is because once you press down on the terminal blocks, it will make the connection. But you don't want that to happen until you've got the wires in their proper place. So once you're ready, once you've got all the wires in the proper holes and you've double and triple checked your color codes, keep in mind that you don't have to go through the ordeal of flattening out the wire and cutting them off square and straight and all of that. This makes it a much easier job. Once it's all there, I use slip joint pliers. It seems to be the easiest. Open them up to their whitest setting, and then on each side of the white terminal blocks, just squish towards the middle. You will find that the black plastic housing that came along with it will now pop out, and you can just throw that away. Your connection for the for all four pairs are automatically made by squishing down on the terminal blocks. Now all you need to do is trim off the excess wire that's sticking out of the end. And 4 more on the other side. And now with that done, we're ready to put the aluminum bushing together for the ground. this gets a little tricky. There's one little pin and one little hole on each side of each of those halves. And it's really hard to line up just by sight. It's almost, you've got to feel for it. But once you got it lined up, there's two different ways that I've seen people make the ground connection with the ground wire. One is to gap all of the individual leads of the braided ground, of the braided shield, so that it's completely surrounding the jacket. And then once you've got the aluminum bushing housing in place, just wrap all the ground wires up over it. The other way I've seen, and the way I was taught, is to keep the ground wire twisted as one particular group of wire altogether, and just wrap it around basically so that when the cable grip goes into position, it's pushing the ground wire onto the bushing, onto the aluminum housing. Snip off the excess, and now you're ready to insert that into the rest of the housing. Now, the terminal block for the RJ45, you'll notice on the circuit board there's one side that has contacts and one side that's blank. You need to look down the barrel of that connector to make sure you're putting the contacts to the contacts inside of the barrel. It can go the opposite direction, so be careful of that. Once you've got both of those housings together, you can put it inside of the barrel. Make sure you're lined up properly. And everything else goes together pretty much like a regular Ethercon does. The difference here, you don't need to worry about having a receptacle to tighten up the boot. It's such a solid structure, there's no way that the RJ45 end of it can slip. But it's a much more... Lastly, I'd like to show you a chart of the difference between the Cat5 and the Cat5E. This will show you the difference between their rates of how much data per second each can handle. Keep in mind that's not the speed of each cable, it's just the capacity that the cable can handle. And the chart right after this will show you the difference between the Cat6 and Cat7. So when you get a chance, look these up on.
Sorry, that ended rather abruptly.
That's okay. We did have a couple questions, Fedj, if you have some time.
Yeah, certainly.
So I know the last clip just mentioned what is the difference between Cat5, Cat6, and Cat7. So that was the first question. So if you feel that was answered, I can move to the second one.
Well, the basic difference is the capacity. Sorry. I was hoping to share my video, but I guess I can't. The capacity of data that can be shared over the course of 1 second. it's not a question of speed per se. The data is not moving any faster. There's just more data that's capable of transmitting and being received in the time span of 1 second. It's kind of like amperage. And I really don't know if that's a specific with the amount of shielding or the gauge of the wire. I just know that's the rating. It really, when you get to Cat7, it's a significant amount higher capacity than the Cat5. But keep in mind, this is copper wire. So we're reaching the threshold at Cat7. There is Cat8, but at that point, you're right on the cusp of fiber optic. And but certainly copper wire would be a cheaper way to go. But that's the basic difference.
Great. We do have a couple more questions. The next one is, which cable is suitable for Dante audio networking?
I have it. I have heard recommendations that Cat6 is the way to go as a low-end standard. Before Cat6 was even around, everybody was running Cat5E Cat5E. It's funny because I always called it Cat5S until I did the research for this. But yeah, Cat6 with the capacity available in the wire. The point is with any of the Dante, or actually any device that's transmitting and receiving data, it's not the cable that makes it faster. It's just the capacity of the cable that allows it. So when Cat6 came out, it became instantly the go-to for Dante, for AES, and I can't remember the other, it doesn't matter.
Great. Yeah, we have a couple more questions. So other than getting both ends the same, is there a performance difference between the A and the B standard you showed?
All I've heard is that the standard protocol for the color codes, orange is transmit and green is receive. But when it comes to the actual performance of the cable, I don't think there is any. And as it turns out, it was Bell Labs that established with the RJ11 cable, which is the standard plug you plug your telephone into. They wanted the first line of the telephone in the middle two pins, and then the second line outside of those two pins. Then when they got to 6, they did outside of that. And then they started running data. And then they started getting crosstalk. And when they went to 8, they really had troubles. So their solution was, we'll keep the 4 in the middle because that's the way all of our machines are built. And then we'll do a pair on one side and a pair on the other. Now, whether that pair on one side, starting with the orange, which would be transmitting, and the pair on the outside of the center 2, which is in B standard is green, which is receive. I can't say that that one is faster than this one, or if it was green at the beginning and orange on the other, I can't really say that one was faster than the other. The only thing that I can see as a recommendation is that the rest of the world, it's kind of like the metric system. Everybody else internationally uses the B standard. So military, because they travel internationally, uses the B standard.
Okay.
Can't say one's better than the other.
Okay, great. So we have 2 more questions. The next one says, can a punch block be used for a permanent installation?
I don't see why not. For permanent installations, though, you do have the advantage of being able to use solid core wire. Whereas for any of the stuff we're doing for most of our audio, we're usually in circumstances where it's temporary installation or live sound, in which case it needs to be as flexible as possible. Anything that's going to be traveling or moving or anything like that, you should always get stranded wire for it. But as far as the punch block, I don't see why not.
Okay, perfect. So we have one more question. It's, do you also use a tester that measures the real bandwidth supported by the cable?
That's an expensive little gadget. Yes, there is a multitude of testers out there, but boy, do they cost some money. And they can even tell you if there's a failure in any one of the 4 pairs, how far down the line that failure is. But boy, they run a lot of money.
Okay, perfect. Well, that was the last question. I want to thank everyone who joined us today, and thank you, Fedj, for your time. This was a great session.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm glad that you all enjoyed it.
I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Bye, guys.